Hi, everyone. I'm Rana Spacone, and on behalf of the Office of Career Technical and Adult Education, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. I am very excited about today's topic, which comes from all of you folks on the phone from states and programs that have been participating in the CCR Standards in Action project. I have a lot to learn, and so without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Jennifer, who's going to go over a few logistics, and then she's going to turn it over to our main speaker, Susan Pimentel. So enjoy yourself and sit back. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Rana. We do encourage your participation throughout the event. While Q&A is at the end, we urge you to queue up your questions at any point, and we will get to those at that time. To ask a question, all you have to do is send us a note using the chat box, which is in the lower left corner of your screen, and just to be sure to click that send button so that we get those. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can send us a note in that same chat box, or you can also email ccrsia@compartners.com, and we will assist you as soon as possible. Now we will hear from our moderator for today's webinar, which is Sue Pimentel. Sue, welcome.
Great. Thank you. And I want to add my welcome to all. And as Rana and I were reflecting on the webinar and making preparations, we remembered that this is the last official gathering we will have as CCR SIA teams. And as we thought about it, we wanted to just say to all of you how proud we are, what leaders you are in the nation, how you have persevered through challenges, and how you've made a commitment to continue the work after this particular project ends, and how much we've learned from you, and expect to hear from you and learn from you as we move forward. So I just want to give a thanks to you, and I know as we close out, Rana will have some words of her own for all of us. I'm going to go through the agenda. It is on English language learners and how do we support them in terms of their hopes and dreams to get a good job, to go on to training, college, etc. And you will see here that as we go through the agenda, there are some new instructional imperatives that I will talk about given the new standards that we are working from, and states have their own college and career readiness standards, but everybody's really focused on college and career readiness, which is, of course, what we have been focused on for the past 2 years with you. We're actually going to observe a video of ELL instructional practices because what I'm going to bring to you next is the research on realizing opportunities for ELLs in reading, writing, speaking, and listening language, and I'm going to tie it back to what we've actually seen in the video. So I wanted you actually to see it in action because sometimes words don't do it justice. And then talk a little bit about what this means about re-envisioning the education of adult ELLs. I know a lot of you have made contact with one another as you are pursuing this, thinking about this, figuring out how to get organized for ELLs. And then again, we'll have plenty of time, about 15 minutes at the end, for questions and comments. And as Jennifer suggested, you should feel free to add questions as I move along. If something I say doesn't make sense or you would like a little bit more detail on it or whatever, you don't have to hold until 3:10, for example, to write your question. Fine to wait until then, but glad to simply put it in and we'll get to as many questions as we can. And before I start, I want to be able to tell you a little bit about me and my experience and expertise with ELL education. So in 2009, when I was one of the authors of the Common Core State Standards, we had a complement of national ELL experts who so kindly offered their time to sit with me and the team about what they thought was important about the standards. And then right after the standards were put together in 2010, I was invited to be part of the Understanding Language Project. It's one of our LINK resources that you really want to take a look at. And at first I was curious about, well, why include me? I have content expertise, but I'm not an ELL expert. Well, you'll see as it comes true through this presentation how important ELL experts think that we all need to be part of improving and strengthening ELL education. So what I'm going to bring to you today is my 7 years of working shoulder to shoulder with ELL experts as they work to teach me as much as they could about what's important for ELLs based on the research. It was always based on the research. So I'm going to bring that to you today and share with you everything that I know because it has deep implications for how you organize and serve your ELLs moving forward. So let's get started. So the first place that I wanted to start was to quote Lily Wong Fillmore. Many of you may know her and her work. She is one of the leading national experts on ELLs. And I'm going to read the words to you because they're important. So it says, English language learners are provided materials that are so greatly simplified that they provide virtually no exposure to the forms and structures of the language they should be learning. There's a lot of attention and energy focused on turning ELLs into English speakers and not nearly enough on educating them. What ELLs need are authentic and age-appropriate texts with appropriate instructional support from teachers who know how to support language development. The statement is provocative. It's important and provocative and actually poses one of the sort of the central tenets that needs to change in terms of ELL education. When she says there's a lot of attention and energy focused on turning ELLs into English speakers and not nearly enough on educating them, those of you who are ESOL teachers, ESL teachers might say, gosh, when we're teaching ELLs language, of course we're educating them. That is absolutely true, but what Lily Wong Fillmore is attempting to tell us here is that language is action, and the best way to learn language is in the context, in the discipline, with extra language supports. So, this I probably don't need to say much about, the demographic imperatives. That's why so many of you have asked us to do something on ELLs. With the 40% or so of the population of adult students, of your adult students are ELL students, and we know this is increasing. I want to just point your attention to the last bullet here, which talks about accessing post-secondary education or workplaces, especially challenging for ELLs because many cannot meet the entry requirements. And that's one of the big, I think, pushes from ELL experts is what can we do to make sure that not only are ELLs learning the language and can speak the language, but are we teaching them what they need to know in order to function well in college or in the workplace? So what I want to say, I always like to start with this because it's always a good reminder to me. This may come naturally to all of you, but I realize that I have to give myself a reminder all the time that ELLs bring many resources to learning. Knowing another language in our global economy is a good thing. It's a very good thing because I think sometimes I'll talk about myself, I can get caught up in all the challenges and not think about, wow, what if I knew another language? Wouldn't that be a good thing? And that people that come here and have come from another language and are learning English, I mean, my goodness, it sets them up very well for life, and to remember that. We also have to remember that they come with many other resources. Now, I want to say that ELLs are not a monolith. We know that we have ELLs that come in with very little schooling from their home country. We know that they may have lived in real poverty or in war zones, for heaven's sakes, which has sort of interrupted their education in one way or another. But we also should remember that ELLs who are literate in their first language, that a lot of times they share cognates with English. For example, I think in Spanish it could be 30 or 40% of the words have relationship, English to Spanish have relationships, and we should build on that. Also, ELLs, and those of you who teach ELLs know this, that the students often have a heightened awareness of grammatical functions. They're really paying attention because they're working with the syntax of their original language and what then gets dropped, added, rearranged in the new language. They also bring a considerable amount of conceptual knowledge, and certainly can, and life experience. We talk about this with adult students, that these are folks that have worked and lived and struggled and gotten themselves through a lot to be where they are, and we should build on that as a resource. So now I want to just turn to what are some of the traditional instructional practices, and these are ones that the ELL experts are really working to tell us to move away from. So first I'm going to talk about moving away from these and then what they want us to move towards, but it's helpful sometimes to name those. The first is that learning English, this is one of the practices, is oftentimes a bridge that ELLs must cross before they're allowed to study fields of genuine interest to them. They're telling us not to do that. And then kind of connected to that, when that happens, they're left without access to the rich text of academic disciplines. And if you hear them talk, they'll talk about ELLs being given mush to read, which doesn't expand their content knowledge or actually their literacy skills otherwise. Next. So why have these practices endured? There's probably some guesswork here. I can tell you what the ELL experts say. They think that, as is often the case, we think ELLs will be frustrated by anything that is too hard. We make an assumption about that. And that we also think that if we give these students adapted, decodable texts that are greatly simplified, they'll be able to read and access the meaning on their own. But here's the issue, and here's what's forgotten, is that simplified texts don't offer students the complex syntax they need, the complex vocabulary they need, and when you don't have that, you can't begin to understand a complex concept. You've got to keep those pretty simple, pretty minimal, because we depend on the syntax and vocabulary to be able to explain those. And academic language can only be learned by noticing how it works in really authentic texts, engaging with, thinking about, discussing, and writing about their content. And so they're asking us now to shift. I wanted to say one more thing, if I could, Caitlin, before you move the slide, that I think there has been some sense that if students come to us and they don't know English at all, that there is some need, certainly, to give them some of the basics in English. And I think the ELL experts would agree to that. What they say, though, is after you've spent, some time, a couple of months or whatever, it is time actually then to move students in. I think part of the reason we thought they needed to know English before they could cross the bridge into real study in math and literacy and science and history is because we didn't want to overly frustrate them. And you can imagine what a challenge it is. But the experts are telling us to get them in those classes, get them supports, but get them in those classes. So I want to step back for 1 second here, or 1 minute, to talk to you about the ELL Expert Contributions to College and Career Readiness Standards. Now, this was actually during the time we were writing the Common Core State Standards is when we really worked with them. And as you know on the phone, that the College and Career Readiness Standards, and for most states, and certainly the ones that we worked on for adult education that many of you have adapted and adopted, come from the Common Core State Standards. So I just want to run through for you some of the suggestions that they had. And I didn't always understand the impact or the import of what they were saying until later, when I had more in-depth conversations about what was underlying their suggestions. So one was they wanted us to have more global and cultural diversity of the reading selections, and that be strengthened. So there's many of you know about an Appendix B, and they wanted more of that. Made absolute sense, of course, so that their students can see themselves reflected in those texts. The next one, too, added aspects of comprehension monitoring, ability to request clarification, confirm comprehension, ask questions. I know that's a big part of obviously what goes on in ELL instruction now. The next one was interesting because they spoke forcefully in favor of incorporating literacy across the disciplines and helped to sustain their inclusion. What was interesting about that is that and I'm talking about the authors now, we're told to write English language arts standards and not English language arts standards and literacy standards in science and social studies and technical subjects. And our ELL experts were some of the strongest proponents of keeping the literacy skills in there, which we were very pleased about because we thought it was really critical. Only later did I understand how critical it was in terms of their principles, which I'll go into in a little bit. They added standards that require students to adapt their writing and speaking to a variety of contexts and communicative tasks. Again, you can see they're asking students to write across the curriculum. They're asking students to be able to know how to write in a discipline. We were very glad to see that as well. And again, I'll talk about its import. And certainly the last one about grammar and usage be acquired through communication and comprehension, but it not be an isolated, in an isolated context. And so those were the key areas that they asked us to attend to, and there were good reasons behind it that I didn't always understand when they first gave us those recommendations. So what does this mean about the new standards and the new imperatives? So it means that ELLs learn language best when they engage with content. It means that with support, ELLs have to be given the opportunity and a lot of opportunities to participate in classroom discourse focused on rich and exciting academic content. It means that what the ELL experts are saying is that ELLs can gain the complex language skills for school and for life by working with complex, demanding reading materials, not the mush that is oftentimes provided to them. And the next is that there's really meaning-making going on, that we're immersed in that. Yes, there's grammatical functions, forms and functions that we need to pay attention to, but that those come under the heading of meaning-making. It's done in the context of communication that's important. And then also remembering that ELLs come with existing talents, their background knowledge, their interests and motivations, and to make sure that we build on those. Next slide. So the bottom line is that much more time and attention needs to be placed on educating ELLs. This is taking right from Wong Fillmore's quote, not just on turning ELLs into English speakers. And that this is important, that academic language is context dependent. So who is using it? What is being communicated, how it is being used, and what purpose it is being used for becomes critical. And if we aren't providing students with opportunities for using language in context-dependent situations, then we're going to leave students unprepared for what they may also want to do in their life. And it also means that ELLs can no longer be considered the sole responsibility of a small cadre of language specialists who are working their hearts out to get ELLs prepared in English. So it really means that ELLs have to become a shared responsibility, yes, with our ESL teachers and with our ABE teachers. So I added this slide in about the relationship between language and meaning, and some of you might look at this and say, duh, oh, well, of course. But it hadn't really occurred to me until it was presented to me. So let me just say here that language is made up of thousands of words, which we know. Many of them have multiple meanings, and sometimes when they're put together, they have these complex relationships. So I had that in my head, but why they keep talking, the ELL experts keep talking so much about meaning is that we have to then put those words together to be able to communicate anything. So in phrases and sentences and paragraphs and charts and diagrams, to make explanations, to discuss anything, to arguments, language is an essential tool for connecting the different pieces of what we know. So there's a very tight connection between language and meaning or content. So here's the old paradigm. which is, this comes from the Understanding Language Project, where we thought before, and this would even be some of the English language learner experts around that thought, well, there was language and there was meaning or content, and the overlap was mostly vocabulary and grammar. And so there's a little bit of an overlap, and we should recognize that. But the new paradigm, as you will see, is that there's a much greater overlap. So the more I'm spending time on meaning and content and spending time on language, that allows me then to participate in discourse, reading complex text, explanation, argumentation, author purpose, text structure. You see all the way down, yes, vocabulary and grammar are there, but my ability to learn the language depends on my ability to gain meaning in a particular discipline around argumentation, author purpose, etc. So, now we're going to watch a grade 8 video of ELA literacy classrooms of ELL students. I wanted to say a couple of things. So one is that for those of you who were part of the CCR SIA workshop on observing students, you'll recognize this video because it was one of the ones we worked on together, observed, and used the CCR SIA observation tool against. The other thing, so it'll be great for you to look at it again. I probably looked at it, probably a dozen times or more, and I never tire of it. What I'd like you to do as you watch the video is perhaps even take notes about the kinds of scaffolds or supports you see the teachers making in the video. And what I'm going to do after the video is then tie it to the research about good practices. So before we start the video, I want you to know if it doesn't appear right on the screen, you should be hearing the video in a second. If you don't hear that, if you look on your computer, you'll see there's something called links. It's right above the chat box, and there's called ELL Instructional Practices Video. So if for some reason your browser doesn't bring up the video as we put it on, you can just click right on that and follow along. It's about 12 minutes long.
One of the big questions that we want to debate today is, should the United States government help undocumented immigrants? And we're going to do that by looking at articles that present the different arguments and kind of thinking about what kind of language is being used and who's making the stronger arguments. Okay? So we're going to start with our first article on the smartboard. And as we're reading today, we want to focus on two main questions. We addressed writing from sources in our lesson today because to write an argumentative essay, it needs to be all backed up with relevant evidence, evidence that comes from a source.
So we want to talk about the DREAM Act. Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Okay? We want to think about, should the United States government help these undocumented immigrants? Okay? Should we help them get an education? Should we help them stay in the United States? So that's going to be our focus question today.
We were really hoping that students were able to identify what the author's position on undocumented immigrants was.
We're going to start by reading an article, and we're going to try and identify the author's position on this issue. Should the United States government help undocumented immigrants? We're going to look for the words that tell us, does the author think that this is good? Does the author think this is bad? Okay, so right now what we're going to do, we're going to look two different colors, green for good and my pink
for bad. What they were doing was really conducting research on the topic of undocumented immigrants. What they were looking for was strong evidence, whether it was in support or against. And then what they'll do is, as they're ready to write and to stake their own claim, they'll go back to that evidence that we were looking at today, and they'll use that to support their position on that issue. So as we're reading, I want to pay attention to the words that we see. What tells us that this is good? What tells us that this is bad? Okay? The DREAM Act is so full of loopholes that passage would result in a nightmare for our nation. There's another word in there that is very negative. Does anyone know what word in there is very negative? Nightmare. Right? Nightmare is a bad dream. So I'm going to highlight that again with my pink highlighter. Let's continue. Perhaps if the DREAM Act... We have a very diverse student population where they come from 20 different countries. They speak 14 different languages. All of them are English language learners, anywhere from beginner to just tested out proficient. Within that, we have newcomers who really have come within the past 2 months of the school year, and we have students that were born here in the United States and have been speaking English since they started in kindergarten. We pair them in linguistic partnerships when available so that students are seated next to someone who speaks the same language as them. That really helps to put in place those partnerships where they can ask for clarification and directions, for help understanding a text. They can practice their thoughts in their first language before then producing in English, which really is a huge scaffold for them to ultimately being able to comprehend and produce in English.
The author's claim is que las personas ilegales aquí en este país no deben de tener oportunidades para ir a la universidad porque están rompiendo las reglas. Y también, por ejemplo, digamos, personas aquí, los niños de los padres inmigrantes no tienen la culpa de nada porque ellos vinieron a una edad muy pequeña. No tenían control sobre para qué, si venir o no venir. Yo creo que el punto de vista del autor es que los inmigrantes indocumentados tienen que tener otra oportunidad para ser legales en este país.
It's an overwhelming task to implement the Common Core for a group of diverse learners such as English language learners, but I think it's important to focus on the students and to focus on individual students. And when we're thinking about English language learners, progress is what matters. It's a hard goal for some of these students. A student who came here last year, they might not be on grade level in English this year, and that's okay. It's important that we assess where they are, we put in the scaffolds necessary to help them improve those skills, and that they're constantly making progress where it counts.
Y aquí dice también en el primer párrafo, dice que las personas indocumentadas en Georgia pueden ser beneficiadas por el DREAM Act, acordando por el, ¿cómo se dice eso? Porcentaje reciente. Eso.
The next step in this lesson would be for them to continue the work that they started doing today with articles that we're presenting them so they can get another day or two of really examining the author's use of strong language and determining evidence. Who can tell me what the author's claim seems to be in this article? Asif?
The author's claim is that the government should help the undocumented immigrants.
And how did you find that out? What in the article, what kind of words did you see?
In the article, it says that those children were brought to this country by their parents at a very young age. So it's not their fault, it's their parents. Because their parents, when they were small, their parents brought them to this country.
So it's not their fault that they came here undocumented, you're saying, okay? Would someone like to add on to that?
I disagree with Asif because in the article it's saying that people here in the illegal people in the United States should not get benefits because here in the article it says that we as taxpayers, we have invested in their education and deserve a chance to go to college. So I think that I disagree with Asif still.
So do you think the article is saying that they should have a chance to go to college?
Yeah.
Because the taxpayers have already invested in their education?
Yes.
Well, Asif's point was that they were brought here without really a choice. So their parents brought here, the parents decided to bring them here, right? Because it was, their choice to come to America, but the children were young. They were just following along with their parents. I think that's what his point was. But you're bringing up another point that the article is addressing, which is that we have already educated these undocumented immigrants and that they should now get an opportunity to take the next step and go to college. So for looking at the whole article and looking at all the details, does the author think that the undocumented immigrants should get help from the U.S. or not? Mohammed?
Yes, because it says here they should, for the DREAM Act, the author wrote that undocumented students should be provided with legal resident if they graduate from high school and completed their 2 years of college and our military service.
So excellent. So that clearly shows the author's position.
Yeah.
They really have to work at defending their claim, and once they have their assignment, they're going to have to go research and find that strong evidence so they can really support what they're trying to say.
It says that President Obama wants to support them, but first they have to learn English and have to pay fees because they entered the country illegally.
And for this paragraph, the author's position is that it's positive because the author says that illegal immigrants take jobs away from the American workers. That means that it's unfair for the American workers that has a document because they're stealing jobs from American workers. Yeah.
This is a skill that our students really need a lot of practice with, and it's actually something that we focused on the whole year with them, pulling from sources and backing up their claims with evidence that matches that claim. This type of practice where we're analyzing, we're breaking up the process by using a graphic organizer, it really helps them navigate through everything that they need to pull from the text in order to move on to the next step, which is writing the essay. So who would like to share their piece of evidence? Asif?
The government should not help the undocumented immigrants because the text says they said that illegal immigrants take jobs away from American workers.
Brittany?
I agree with Asif because the government should not help undocumented immigrants because the text says illegal immigrants broke the law by sneaking into the country and that they shouldn't be rewarded for it. And I'll put it here.
Eduardo?
The government should help undocumented immigrants because they came for a better lifestyle. For example, the text states that my mom came for a better life. Okay.
So that would go on the pro side. Excellent. Roy?
The U.S. doesn't support the immigrant because they want to intensify illegal immigrants and deport them.
Excellent. So that would go on the con side.
We think about the end goal, and in this case it's writing an argumentative essay. And we think about the steps that the students need to take there, and also at the end of this lesson, where do they need to be. One of the things that we've really focused on is author's position, because it's most important that you're able to make a strong claim and back that up with evidence. If the author wants to make their position strong, why wouldn't he just give evidence for one side of the argument? Why did the author propose and give those examples for both sides of the argument? John?
Author was talking about both sides because maybe one reader will have the opinion of, I think the author is wrong because the government shouldn't help it, and then maybe someone else will have another opinion.
Why is it important for him to address both sides of the issue? Why shouldn't he just address one side? Why does he want to put the other point of view into his article? Mohammed?
He could prove that the other side is wrong than about what his opinion is, and so he could support his idea, what he's saying about the author, about the issue, and then talks about the other, and then proves that they're wrong.
Right, exactly, to prove that the other side is weaker, that the other argument is wrong. I know that these texts are above their reading level, especially since English is their second language, and I think that they are really driven and they want to learn and they want to achieve something, and I think that that extra challenge might even just be more of a motivator for them.
Great, we're back. So what I'm going to do now is go through reading, the research in reading, the research in writing, the research in speaking and listening, and in language, and I'll do some tiebacks to what we actually saw in the video. So in reading, what do we know about CCR standards? They require students to read and comprehend literature and informational texts of increasing complexity, and they challenge ELLs, obviously, to accurately process this intricate and oftentimes complicated linguistic and cultural features while trying to understand and comprehend content. So what does the research tell us? So ELL research on reading tells us, and this was actually, some of the research was actually compiled after the Common Core State Standards were put together, so you'll see some reflections of that, was to choose complex, authentic texts that are brief, interesting, and engaging for students. You'll see that I marked a little asterisk by several of these that I think we see in the video. In 12 short minutes, you'll see all the things that I think we see reflected. And one of them is it definitely were interesting and engaging for students about undocumented immigrants. The next one we didn't see, but one of the things that the ELL experts tell us to look for is be careful of complex texts that are, we have the quantitative measure and then we have the qualitative features. On the qualitative features, look for one or two that are complex. If they're complex all the way through, it becomes much more complicated to teach. So if it's lexically dense, you might look for simpler grammatical structures. If it has sort of many meanings to it or purposes to it, then you might look for vocabulary that is more accessible. So not to pick texts that are complex in so many features, it becomes complicated for the teacher to teach. Connect to a given unit of study and build students' knowledge of a topic. I think we heard the teacher say that they were spending quite a bit of time on this. They had spent a couple of days, and we'll do a couple more days. This is part of a larger unit. Provide texts that have sufficient details and examples. I marked this one because I think as you saw, as they were putting the graphic organizer together, that there were lots of examples, that the authors gave lots of examples, lots of details about why they were supporting, in support of their position. And then contain ideas that can be discussed from a variety of perspectives. Obviously, they've been given two texts, and they were presumably opposing views, and so you could come at this issue from many perspectives. The ELL research on reading continues. So we said read the text aloud at the start of the lesson and then facilitate a discussion about the words in the text. We don't know what happened maybe on the first or second day they were reading on this, but remember the small group where the teacher there read through a paragraph at the beginning and then asked about the words in the text. That's exactly what she did, especially with students who were needing extra support. I didn't concentrate on a small set of academic vocabulary words because we don't necessarily know that happened. I can imagine that happened, and certainly the teacher that was working with the small group was focusing in on words, but those were more descriptive words about how you knew how the author felt about the subject, which is also important instruction. The next is to build on and expand ELL's knowledge about how different kinds of texts are structured. They're obviously working with argument text here, and so they're spending time on looking at what the author's claim is, looking at the reasoning the author's using, looking at the evidence that the author is putting forth, so they're understanding that this is a certain kind of text, an argument text, and how it's structured, so I marked that one. The next one we don't know. Provide necessary contextual information and leverage ELL's background knowledge without paraphrasing or preempting the text for students. It could have happened. Well, I don't think we saw it. One could imagine that the subject matter itself about undocumented immigrants is probably one that many of them have, being an immigrant themselves, whether they are pro and con on the issue, have probably thought about this, discussed it, paid attention to this, in their own lives. But we don't know that for certain. This one says offer readers more accessible text. So this gets into, if you can remember, as we've done our work with you about text sets, about bringing texts on the same subject that are easier for students to access, to bring them up to complex text quite quickly. The research says that is a good strategy to be using in preparation for reading more difficult texts on a topic. And including those in a student's own home language or their first language, language one as it's called there. So something that you've learned about making text accessible to even students whose first language is English is helpful here, as you're seeing with English language learners. Simplify the wording of the questions. Again, I marked this one because I thought in the small group, the teacher took the major questions that everybody, all the different pairs of students were asking, and was rephrasing them. Here you'll see one that I just rephrased to show you how it could be much simpler, stated. What does the author tell us about the historical event, how this historical event affects Mexico today, and a way to reword it would be, how did Mexico change because of the Aztec period? So you can see that there was some rewording of questions there and simplifying the wording. Provide additional instruction in small groups, which we definitely saw in the video, and focus readers' attention on meaning, critical, grammatical structures. I don't think we saw that, but that's again about grammar is in service of meaning making. Now I want to turn to writing. So we know that the standards require students to write different types of text for varied audiences and purposes, analyze information, and present knowledge gained through research. And again, I just want to take you back to what the English language learner experts asked us to do. If I could just take us back, you don't have to turn it back in terms of the slide, but that reading, that they wanted students to read complex, engaging texts that were interesting to students, which we definitely had there. And here about writing text in a variety of ways. The CCR standards require that, and it challenges ELLs to use their language skillfully, to cite specific evidence when crafting arguments and writing reports. So what does the research tell us? The ELL research tell us about writing. Well, the first thing it tells us, and this is true probably, you might say, in anything we're going to be teaching any student, but becomes really critical here. And I've heard this both voiced to me and then written in research, which says give ELLs meaningful ideas to write about rather than mechanical exercises. So rather than teaching students how to write a paragraph, just, about anything, or tell them to write it about X, Y, Z, give them something meaningful to do. So you're not just teaching them about topic sentences and, the meat of the paragraph and the sentences and the conclusion, that you're really asking them to prepare something, to communicate something through their writing. Provide writing opportunities that are anchored in content to extend student learning and understanding. We all know ourselves, if we write about something that we've read, we generally learn more about it. It sort of forces us to do that. You could see that going on in the lesson. I have that starred. Strategically used tools, visuals and graphic organizers. I think we saw this a lot in the video. We saw them using different colored magic markers for both negative words, I think, and positive words, or something close to that. And then we also saw the graphic organizer that they were all working with in the whole group. And graphic organizers are a great scaffold and support to students. Use a set of instructional routines that support students as they generate and organize their ideas for writing research. I marked this one because although we don't know the habits all the way along in every single lesson, I marked it because the students seemed very comfortable in doing the following. First, the teacher had partnered them, so they were working with a peer. They were asked to discuss what they saw and heard and understood in the two texts. Then they were asked to put their thoughts, both pro and con, on sticky notes and to talk to each other about that. And then eventually those sticky notes ended up on a graphic organizer. And I don't know if you recall, but the teacher said this is all in preparation. I mean, first for their understanding of what is being communicated in the text, but also because they will be writing their own argumentative essay that will make a claim, and they'll have to support it with evidence about where they land on the issue. And so she set up all of these routines to set them up for success in their writing. The research also tells us, this was an interesting one for me to learn about providing feedback to ELLs on the content of their writing. What the research tells us is that focus on the instructional objective of the writing. So if the instructional objective is that if you make a claim, you have to have lots of good details and evidence to support that claim, provide feedback to ELLs on that. If your instructional objective is, it could be verb tense, right? It could be syntax, getting the words in the right order. And you've done a lesson on that, and you tell students you want to see that reflected in their writing, then give feedback on that. The point on this one, on the feedback one, was not to discourage ELLs as they're working with a new language, that you don't try to redline their whole paper where, they have spelling mistakes, they have syntax, they've got, but that you really try to focus on the instructional objective, or instructional objectives. You could have two. You could have a grammar one and also a meaning-making one. The next is provide ELLs with meaningful exposure to mentor text. So it would be something that students would understand. We did not see that in this instance, where you would show students what you are after, what a model is. I know a lot of times I look for that as I'm supposed to respond to someone on something. Well, what are they expecting? Is there a format they're expecting? Is there certain kinds of information they're expecting? How detailed do they want me to be? The next one, again, that we saw was allowing ELLs to use their home languages or a variety of language during the writing process. We certainly saw that with the two young Spanish-speaking men who were talking in pairs. And the last one was interesting for me to think about, because writing skills are actually affected by linguistic and cultural backgrounds that may or may not align with the standards. This was important for me to get in my head, because I did not think about this. I was told by a couple of the ELL experts that the word argument in some cultures is considered to be offensive and insulting, and you don't do it. And so here we are, our standards are replete with argument, and it's important to address that. And I was so interested in this that I wanted to show you I did a little more research on what linguists tell us about sort of the cultural aspect of language, because I thought it was interesting and something to think about as we teach ELLs that come from a variety of places. So typical Chinese style. Now this is, again, if you've learned to write in Chinese, what they expect. And what's interesting is they really praise eloquent language, and they avoid making direct points or arguments. And here we are in our standards. What does it require? Direct points or arguments. Typical Arabic style. They don't present different perspectives or counter arguments. I don't know if you recall, but the teacher asked the student to talk about what a counter argument is, how it functions in the text. She did it very explicitly. And again, depending upon your background, if counter arguments aren't anything you've learned about before, really important to be explicit about it. Typical Japanese style. So part of it I sort of got, or maybe sort of would have known if I began to think deeply about it, is that their writing's more restrained, undemonstrative, cautious, and understated. You can imagine in the standards when we talk about word choice and that it be lively, that it be descriptive, that if you learned from a Japanese school or in the Japanese culture that you're more restrained, that might be something that you want to address. And what was interesting was that they also really give great credence to flashes of insight without a lot of logical reasoning, which was something that was a surprise to me, because what do we require in our standards? Logical reasoning. Finnish style, interesting to do Finnish, but does not prepare the audience for what to expect or for the conclusions. And oftentimes when we're writing, we want to make it clear what our claim is and that what we're about to do. And then obviously the rules of articles and tenses do not exist in many languages. And so it's just important to think about what that means in terms of teaching students, that sometimes we have to be explicit about these things and help them through, because they've learned something very different in their language one. Speaking and listening. So So obviously they require students to articulate their own ideas and build on others' ideas in a variety of different settings. So that's what it requires students to do and challenges students to do. So what does the ELL research tell us about this? It talks to us about developing meaningful collaborative tasks that allow ELLs to use their full linguistic and cultural resources. I think we saw that. And by meaningful, they're really talking about not just having a discussion and being able to discuss anything, but discuss the things they're reading and researching and attempting to understand. And we definitely saw that. Provide ELLs with daily opportunities to talk about content in pairs or small groups anchored by topics in the text. We definitely saw this. What the research goes on to say is that allowing students to work in pairs or in small groups allows them to practice with a peer before they're asked to present their finding or understanding or claim to a whole class of students. We can all imagine that giving practice to us in a small group or in it with a peer is just, it feels more accessible and gives us some real practice and some confidence. The next, so I marked that one, structure student groups and provide guidance to facilitate the discussion, and we definitely saw that going on in the lesson. Allowing ELLs to collaborate in their home languages as they work on tasks to be completed in English. We saw that. Again, the research suggests that students be allowed to do this in when they're writing and when they are involved in a particular discussion. And we definitely saw that go on. She had paired students, as you recall, by their language so that they could actually do that. And sometimes you'll be able to do that, and sometimes you may not be able to do that. But the research says when you can, do it. Include listening comprehension activities designed to help ELLs arrive at a reasonable interpretation of extended discourse. So you aren't asking ELLs that are new to the country, or even if they've been here for a couple of years and they're still picking up all the vocabulary and so on and so forth, that you aren't asking them to understand every single word literally. What you're wanting them to do is to get the gist, to get a reasonable interpretation, to be able to support their ideas. And we need to, again, it's that notion of not expecting students to have learned everything they have to have learned in English in order to participate. And again, I think we saw that going on in the classroom. Allow ELLs to engage productively using language that is still under development and may exhibit non-native or imperfect features. I mean, I thought the students did marvelously well in the video that we saw, but you could also hear that students were still working on, they had an accent or a stronger accent that maybe they'll have, as they move along. But that's allowed and to be encouraged. So now let's get to language. So now we're sort of at the grammar and conventions and vocabulary part of the standard. So it requires students to choose language and conventions that achieve particular functions and rhetorical effects. Remember, that was really important to the ELL experts about making sure that it's connected to meaning making. And then it challenges students to use grammatical structures and vocabulary and written and oral conventions as meaning-making resources so they can actually communicate, that their writing and their speaking will actually communicate. So what does it tell us here? It says that the ELL research on language development tells us to recognize the limitations of teaching discrete language features in isolation. It tells us to focus on language and grammar in conjunction with and in service of meaningful academic work across the curriculum, which again I think we saw in the video. It tells us, those of us who are teaching ELLs, to allow imperfect, non-native, developing language, to encourage that, to reward that, to not expect otherwise. And this is just an important one for us to, again, and I have to remember this one myself sometimes, because sometimes unconscious biases can get in the way. And that is, remember, no speakers of any language are without an accent, and from a linguistic standpoint, there are no varieties of language that are superior to any others. There just aren't. And so it's just, again, having that basic respect, which I know all of you on the phone do, but important reminders that we don't let unconscious biases enter in when we're teaching ELLs. So I want to just talk just briefly about the pedagogical shifts for language acquisition, just sort of as a recap here. So language acquisition as an individual process, they're saying move from that to language acquisition as apprenticeship in social context. Moving from language as grammatical structures or functions taught in isolation from academic work in various school disciplines to language as action in and through meaningful and engaging activities across the curriculum, subsuming structure and function. So that's really sort of the central tenet of what the ELL experts are asking us to do. Again, thinking about language acquisition, it isn't linear, that we should think about nonlinear language development aimed at comprehension and communication. So again, the goal is comprehension and communication. And don't think about individual isolated ideas or text as the center of instruction, but attention to ideas that are interconnected by purpose and topic. And I think as you think about the CCR standards themselves, remember one of the shifts, important advances is about building knowledge, and we know the connection between building knowledge and students' ability to access text. Well, it is the same for ELLs here, that if you have, remember what they talked about, having more accessible text, initially and moving up, so text sets. So a lot of what the research tells us, obviously there are some things that are particular to ELLs, but a lot of what is good instruction for students that have a first language of English is also good for ELLs. So then just thinking about teaching complex text. So rather than using simple or simplified text, they're asking us to read rich, complex text. Do you remember when the teacher said at one point that she thought that that it was quite a challenge for many of the students in the class to be reading these particular texts, but she thought that the challenge itself was something that that the students liked. They wanted it. Now, again, you got to have supports, and you don't want to over-frustrate students, but that knowing that they were working with challenging texts drove them, I think she talked about it, driving their desire to really understand. And I've heard Tim Shanahan, who is a literacy expert, talk about the same, that it's okay to be totally honest with students in the class that you're reading a more complex text, and students like to know that you've respected their brain, that they're about to have a challenge, and it's okay. Using activities to pre-teach content or to simply help students get through text? No. Use activities to scaffold students' understanding and autonomy. Identifying discrete structural features of language versus exploring how language is purposeful and patterned to do its particular rhetorical work. And again, grammar study out of context, move from that to really supporting students' understanding of text with meaning. So now I'm just going to go through what this challenges all of us to do. So ABE teachers are challenged to view themselves as teachers of language and teachers of content, to find ways to help students understand and use language that are valued in the content area in which they are teaching, and develop new ways to support students in using emerging and developing language in the classroom to perform in the content area. So ABE teachers are challenged, and ESL teachers are challenged. So certainly providing ELLs, especially those new to the United States, with additional support. There's probably additional support needed all the way through. But re-envision their role and responsibility to teaching the forms and functions of a second language in isolation from disciplinary practices, to preparing students for engagement in content area classes. Maybe it's both preparing them and supporting them while they're in content area classes. That means that state and program leadership, so many of you on the phone, means to provide supports that focus on how to connect content to language instruction. to provide time and structures that support ESL and content area teachers so they can coordinate and collaborate, and build coherence so that all the components of ELL instruction point in the same direction. Teachers are going to need to be supported in this. There's always a publisher challenge, and that is to match materials to the new standards in ways that focus on greater use of the language, to move beyond, to not just give simplified text, which we hear so many complaints about from all of you who work with ELLs, and to move beyond glossaries and highlighted vocabulary as the only way to address language demands. The research tells us so much more. So now I'm just going to run through 10 steps to Reenvision ELL Education. So the first is just a reminder, and maybe this is to me, that is a good reminder for me all the time, that we recognize that learning another language is an ability, it's not a disability. That educators recognize that the development of English is fueled often by students' primary language skills, so there are resources that they come with that we should build upon. That ELLs have full access to disciplinary classes and engage in academic discourse before they have fully learned English. So again, it's not learning English and then crossing the bridge over to college and career readiness classes. There's a little bit of support given initially, and then allow them to be part of the classes. ELLs allow them to meaningfully participate in classes with imperfect language. The next one, which we've been talking about, is rich, authentic, level-appropriate, complex text. They need to be able to have access to those. Engage in enriched rather than simplified communication. So these are, remember we've talked a lot about that in the speaking and listening, that they're engaged in important discussions about important things that they have read and researched. That they're given instructional supports that do not supplant or compromise the rigor or the content, which I think again we saw in that in that video. Yes, students need supports. We need to give them to them. And there were some little scaffold flags that came down to talk about what they were doing, and that's important. But it didn't supplant or compromise the rigor content. No one was telling these students what was in these texts. ABE teachers are supported in figuring out how to attend to both content and language, and that ESL and ABE teachers are provided ample time and supports to collaborate and coordinate their teaching of ELLs. And then the last one, which I think we just have to become more demanding consumers, is that teachers and students have materials that address the language demands within the text and provide supports for the new standards. And I think publishers are just getting around to doing this. Some of you may know of good resources that you'd want to share with all of us, but I know they're just beginning to get to this. Some of the ones are coming out of the market now. So I wanted to say, I saw one question come across about who are these ELL experts, and I want to give you some of the names, not all of the names. Kenji Hakuda is one, and he led the Understanding Language Project. Mariana Castro, Gary Cook, Amanda Kibler, who I worked really closely with, George Bunch, who we wrote an article together, Oki Lee, Lydia Stack, former TESOL president, Guadalupe Valdez, many of you may know, Aida Walke from WestEd. Those are just some of the names that were I was having the great honor of working with over these past years. If you go to the Understanding Language Project, you can see there are a multitude of other experts there that we met and talked, and I certainly learned from some of what they've written, some of what they've said to me. There's an article where some of this research has been drawn from there. Persuasion Across Time and Space, I think this is one of our links resources. It's a unit that was written by the smaller literacy team, mainly by Aida Walke and her folks from WestEd, and then we added to it, the literacy team added to it, which shows you it was a grade 8 unit getting students to be ready to read, if you can believe it, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in grade 8. And they've actually tested it in, I know, Charlotte-Mecklenburg, I think Denver, Colorado, made some adjustments to it. So it's a great unit to show both strategies to use with students, but also to great effect. The next one is a practice guide, the Teaching Academic Content and Literacy to English Learners, that I drew on heavily here. It's a great practice guide. It's very easy to look at and read. There's more detail in the practice guide than even I've given you here, so take a look at that. And there are two frameworks. One's from the Council of Great City School, and one is from CCSSO, the Council of Chief State School Officers. And they're both excellent resources. The second one will actually take the College and Career Readiness Standards and talks about the analytical tasks they require and some of the receptive and productive language that is needed in order for students to access and work with the standards. So there are some good charts in there to use for that. And lastly, and we'll get to our questions, as you know, OCTAE is working on English language proficiency standards for adult education. It'll come out sometime in the fall of 2016. There will be online professional development modules that will be built in 2017. And as always, Rana stands ready to answer specific questions as you direct them to her. She'd rather have you write to her, or if you have a particular question, I'm sure they'll be coming out with some materials when they are ready to do so. And at this point, Rana stands ready to answer your questions as you write to her from there. So, with that, I think we're ready to take some questions. And I will move up over here. Okay, who are the ELL experts? So I think look at both the resources that I've provided, plus some of the names that I gave you there. Dory asked another question, is there a minimum SPL for the ELLs being referred to in this presentation? So my answer would be no. It's a good discussion to have, however, in your programs and in your state. I will say that, and you'll see this in the Understanding Language Persuasion Across Time and Space unit, maybe even in the framework that I responded to about CCSSO's framework, it will talk about giving students a modicum of English exposure and teaching prior to simply plunking them in a disciplinary class. I don't know if they get down to, what level of testing do you want, but I think what they're saying is err on the side of getting students in those classes quickly. Let me go down. The video is powerful, Rochelle says, and I totally agree with her. How can we encourage, this is from Janet, how can we encourage this type of first language discussion if our class makeup is 60% speakers of one language, however the remaining students represent speakers of numerous other languages with no overlap? So I obviously, in the video we saw you could pair students. No opportunity maybe for that if indeed students come with very, very different languages. But I would also say that allowing students to work in pairs, even as they attempt to communicate with one another, can build confidence of ELLs with their peers. So let me see if I get the next part of your question here. Should we still try this first language discussion when initially tackling complex text, or have all students use English so that some don't have that advantage? I'm not sure who you think is getting an advantage, but I think one of the things to look for, they saw that both in terms of reading and in terms of writing and research, to allow students, if they know the topic, to allow them and perhaps present to them, or they can find other resources that can, in their own home language, that can get them more up to speed on the content, which then when they switch over to English, with the notion of switching over to English as they can, makes really good sense to allow them to do that. And I would also say that I think that you watch the teacher in the video at times. Remember, there was one student who said this was a pro it was up from the pro text, and then another student brought up the fact that he disagreed because it was something about, well, we've provided education for these students and we should provide education for these students, and so therefore it was a negative, and how the teacher then worked with rewording. I know that those of you who teach ELLs know that you're doing that a lot. We saw in the small group as well where the teacher there was rewording some of what was required and also reading to students aloud as they followed along, and that's a great way to help students who are not yet fluent in English become more fluent. None of this stuff is easy. It's challenging, but all worthwhile. Let's see if I'm seeing here. Okay. Are these pedagogical shifts aimed at ABE, ASE teachers? I think our English language teachers do this well, but they are not using academic and career-infused materials. So I think that what is being recommended is that your English language teachers use academic and career-infused materials. I mean, I think there's a variety of ways, and I don't want to stand over here as an expert about how to reorganize what you do. It could be that if you look at the college and career readiness standards, there may be other important content in science and history or civics that your students need to know as well, and that your ESL teachers, your English language teachers are drawing upon that content as they teach their students. Now, there could be that those students are also enrolled in an ABE class of one sort, and so the teachers are working very closely. But it could also be, I suppose, that the ESL teachers are drawing from the content that they know, whether in civics or in literacy or in math or science, that in order for students to go further, that we'll pull content from those. So I like thinking about ABE teachers having a hand in this, and I think that what I know ELL experts have suggested is that we certainly need our ESL teachers, and they can help so much our teachers that are working in the disciplines, and that they can support one another, but that it probably is best if both ABE teachers and ESL teachers are doing that. So it's a great question, Chelsea. Let's see here. So not new ideas. Let's see. Well, I think that's wonderful. So I think that one of the things that we've seen, you said the slides on 30 and 31, maybe we can go to that. I don't know if you can get to those slides. Caitlin. Make sure I'm responding to the right. I think that if you are already doing this, you are ahead of the game. I think that, and perhaps the ELL experts haven't seen this happening as much as they'd like to, or feeling as if students aren't being taught in this way. And I would say, I don't think a lot of this is necessarily new, but I can tell you that a lot of programs. This is both in K-12 and that I've seen in adult ed, seem to be pretty separated, and seem to be pretty functional. In other words, understand functional English language. I think, Dory, if you've got a great program, I'd love to know what state you're from, where you are already doing this. You are ahead of the game, and I know others on the phone that maybe they're still working with what this means for them. Would like to see it. I can tell you that one of the things that the ELL experts that I've worked with have said is that the new imperatives with the standards and really trying to get all students prepared for college and careers has meant everybody's got to step up their game, if you will, in order to provide the supports necessary and to provide ELLs with access to what it is we say is important for students for college and careers. So with that, I think perhaps they're underscoring what some of this research has been around for a long while, and watching it happen. So I'd love to see you give us an example from how your program's organized, et cetera. We'd love to have some more information on that. Do you have any suggestions for contextualizing ELL instruction to career clusters and workplace? I think that you actually got an interesting suggestion above from one of your peers or colleagues to say that if you know what the interests are of your students, and they may be varied, but that if you could take, if there are areas or careers they're particularly interested in, and then you have students reading and writing and researching about those, and using, could be even technical texts from those particular careers, and having them reading about what students need in order to get a job in a particular career, and what kind of skills do they need to know, and to actually use those texts and experiences and research in that. So let me go down a little further here. In light of, this is from Gay, in light of the strength and research around using native language for ELLs, is the focus on straight immersion moved out of legislation? So I think what you're getting at, Gay, is there are some states, I don't know who on the phone has it, where I think this is maybe what you're getting at, where you're not allowed, the students are not allowed to use their home languages in class. I don't want to get too political here, but the research says that doing otherwise with students is important. I think that I think there are ways also to allow students to do some of the work on their own, where they're encouraged to use their home language. If for some reason in class is a big no-no, then to help support them in doing some of this work and research on their own. Henry, you ask, is there similar research done in mathematics? On the Understanding Language Project site, I think there are some papers that were written about math in particular, and so I encourage everybody to go to that. They had but they did have a complement of ELL experts in the Understanding Language Project that worked specifically with how to help ELLs access mathematics. So go check that out. I don't have some of the answers at my fingertips, but I know their experts do. So there came Kay. Kay came as well. So go to the Understanding Language Project, look for some of the experts that were dealing with math. They had a group that dealt with math, a group that dealt with literacy, I think a group that dealt with science. I'm not sure if we had a group that dealt with history in particular, but I know with the College and Career Readiness Standards in literacy, ELA literacy, in mathematics, and in science, because it's the new generation science standards, that they had folks who were working specifically on those. So then Janet has clarified, because maybe I got it wrong, maybe advantage isn't the right word, just the opportunity to talk in L1 while others won't have a classmate who speaks. Yeah, I know. So I think with the research, Janet, I would say that you're right. If you're in a classroom and there are 10 different languages spoken and there are no pairs that you can put together, it's one of the areas that areas of the research that you cannot draw upon. So I think the only thing I can suggest is that you pay attention to the other elements of the research to assist students. There's no doubt. I think what you're saying is that if you're an English speaker and you were born that way and so on, you may have an advantage over your ELL counterparts. I think that's true. I don't think there's anything we can do about that, but I think what we're hearing is that if our expectations for ELLs are right, remember we heard the teachers say we're looking for progress here, important progress on important content, and that we're holding students both accountable to that, but challenging them is what we need to be doing. So will things be equal? I mean, if I am English speaking and I go into a class, will I understand more immediately? The answer is probably yes. Can I say more and discuss more? The answer is probably yes. On the other hand, my ELL counterpart is learning a second language that I am not learning. So I think there are advantages to be said on both. I want to be cognizant of time. Susan said, I like how this information perspective will help us with new integrated English language civics education. Terrific. I totally agree with you, Susan. In the situation being described, classes quickly become frustrated with the language majority group having the opportunity to discuss in the L1 when others do not. It can create disruptions in the classroom environment. I don't disagree, but I think that keeping students out of those conversations when, again, what the ELL experts are telling us is using language in action is what's most important. Now, you saw in the classroom, now this is an interesting point, Patricia, because you saw in the classroom there, those were all ELL students. So they had students that had just been there for a month or two, I believe she said, and some students that were almost proficient in English but not quite. And she had a whole, so maybe there's another way to organize. Maybe you organize your ELL classrooms so that, yes, they get some ELL instruction that gets supported, but that you have an ELA literacy teacher and you take students who are at various levels of English knowing and you organize your classroom that way. So again, I don't want to preclude people being creative about how to reach the needs of students. We certainly don't want to frustrate students, but neither do we want to keep them away from things that we know they need. So keep thinking and let us know what you come up with. Let me move down here. Says, how do you see the levels of the CCRS corresponding to ELLs, especially those taking classes where their progress is assessed by progression through the NRS, ESL, EFLs? I probably don't want to get into the progression part of it, but I do think that the CCRS, the standards, if you are at, let's say you've come over, you're new to the country, and then you get some instruction in English, and let's say you are at the low intermediate level, an ABE2, for instance, is another way to say it, that you could enter an ABE2 class with the English skills you now have, with all of the resources you bring as in your first language, and then begin to study there. That it's not just a transfer over of ELLs once they get into the adult secondary levels, that it is right away that you would get them into the class. How that gets measured and how programs get credit, I will leave for someone smarter than myself and likely Octay to help with that. Let's see here. Let's move down, and I'm being conscious of time here. I think we need more collaboration, Chelsea says, between our ABE and ASE and language acquisition teachers. Hurrah for that. It would be good to mention Octay's new ESL Pro resources that are now available on links. Thank you, Susan, for that. Chelsea said, we are building these bridges, and it's great to have support from Standards Work and Octay for research and evidence-based practices. Good. And Betsy also talks about the Octay-funded links materials that are really useful, and to mention those. So great. All this assistance is useful. Let's see if there's a question at the end. Let me see. Meeting the language needs of today's adult ELLs addresses many of the pedagogical shifts, as well as a shift in the need for more rigorous instruction and CCRS with adult ELLs at the very beginning levels through advanced. Thank you for that. There are also materials on digital literacy and career pathways that support this work as well. So again, go on links and find that. And Christine from Pennsylvania also says they've used those tools and guiding them to help put lessons together. So terrific. Patricia said, she said they have students, whoops, I just pushed it up too high here. That are speaking, say that students who were speaking English in their class were not newcomers. That's true. Just to mention, I'm drawing on about a decade of experience teaching ESL across ages. This is not something to take lightly. Yes, Patricia, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of work to be done and a lot for us to learn as you all reorganize. Jane says, much of what you suggest and what the research supports too is helpful in thinking about how to provide math instruction to ELLs. So again, I want to send you to the Understanding Language Project thing here. And Lakshmi brings up the boil down to funding. I know there's that to contend with, and I think it's up to our state and program leads there. And Jane says the standards and action tools can also be helpful for ESL teachers. You're absolutely right, with some adaptations. I think you're absolutely right, Jane. I love some of the ideas that are coming through here and want to encourage, and I want to hand this now back over to Rana to close us out, but to say that I know you all are on the front lines working with this. Some of you have been working with this research for a very long time, it sounds like, and have been actually implementing it. So sharing across states, which I know some of you are already doing, is terrific. And Rana, I'm going to hand it back to you to close us out.
Okay, thank you, Susan. And thanks to all of you out there for your great questions and the good discussion that followed Sue's presentation. I like the fact that Jane's comment is the last one, and she refers to the standards and action tools. I'd like to let everyone know that the advanced level SIA materials should be up on links next month, early next month. So look for those refined materials, because I completely agree with Jane that they will be useful tools for ESOL teachers as well. Just a note about our upcoming release of English language proficiency standards for adult education. We expect that report to be out, I would say, within 3 weeks or so, and it will be announced on links. State directors will get an announcement, and we'll be talking about it in Shop Talks. So look for that important document to be coming out soon, because we view it as a great, valuable tool that will help ABE, ASC teachers, ESOL teachers, program leaders, and state leaders address the challenges that Sue cited in her presentation and these instructional imperatives that now exist so that all our students, including ELLs, have access to the CCR standards. We will be following the ELP standards report with the development of online training that will introduce the new standards and will introduce how to use them with understanding. And that work is just getting underway. So I would say sometime in 2017, you will see the beginning results of those training modules. We're planning to develop 3. With regard to the standards and how they may or may not align to the current EFL descriptors for ESL, we are also kicking off a task to examine the alignment between the new ELP standards that are coming out and the existing EFL descriptors. And like the ABE ASE side of the NRS, we expect that we will need to revise the ESL descriptors so that they are based on the ELP standards. So lots of work going on here, and I know that there's an awful lot of work going on in your programs, and I just want to join Susan in thanking you for everything you've done. I have, read everything that's been submitted, and it's been very exciting, and I have been sharing all 12 of your states' progress with my colleagues here at Octay since you all began working on this project 18 months ago. So stay in touch. Send me an email. Give me a call if you have any questions related to standards. And, Susan, I want to thank you again.
You're welcome.
Okay. It's really been a great project, and let's stay in touch. Thanks to all of you.
Thanks, Rana. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. This does conclude today's event, and you may now disconnect.